national security, particularly as it relates to China, is quickly becoming like the new third rail of U.S. politics. I think also increasingly in Europe as well. And so there's incredible bipartisan support for policies that are perceived as being tough on China across a host of issues.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Sarah Bauerle Danzman, who is an associate professor of international studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She is also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., where she is involved in their Geoeconomic Center. She has also worked with the Council on Foreign Relations as International Affairs Fellow, working in the U.S. Department of State as a policy advisor in the Office of Investment Affairs. Sarah specializes in the political economy of international investment and finance. On today's podcast, she and I will be discussing the increasing tensions between the United States, its allies in Europe, and China in the area of investment regulations and restrictions in the context of technological supremacy. Sarah, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today, Adam.
It's a pleasure to have you. So let's get straight into it. What's the current state of U.S.-China relations? Some say that we're in a new Cold War. Let's just take it at that. How bad is it?
Yeah, well, it's not great. And I would say that I kind of think about this in terms of two buckets. So one is very squarely in this kind of tech war kind of frame that you mentioned at the beginning, right? Where we're entering into a period of time in which it seems like there is a rapid development of game-changing technologies that could shift military balance of power. Here I'm thinking particularly of AI and quantum computing. And like nuclear, these technologies likely have first mover advantages. And so a lot of what we're seeing are concerns that the U.S. Is increasingly having around the potential for China to find all sorts of ways to get U.S.-based technology in these emerging sectors from an open economy. And then there's also this other thing that's happening that is maybe a little bit less in this tech frame that I think is really important because we see this as being a key battlefront right now. And that is this shift to a post-carbon economy and what the kind of industrial kind of table is going to look like at the end of that. And so that's when we get into issues around EV battery technology and the war that we are also seeing being fought more on the industrial policy and trade side that is specifically around who gets to be part of the electric vehicle supply chain of the future. So those are like kind of two big things that are happening right now in the US-China kind of technology and trade war. And those two things combined are really creating, a rapid decline in our relations between these countries.
So you would say it's getting worse. I mean, tell us, I guess, can you give us a bit of a history? So what's happened in the last, let's say, 20 years, and then the last 10 years, and the last, say, 2 years that is exacerbated? Because there's always been, in the last 10 years, there's been some tension. In the last 20 years, I think there was more hope. But what's transpired?
Yeah, well, about less than 25 years ago, China was entering into the WTO, right? So that was a period of incredible optimism about the ways in which opening up the Chinese economy was going to create shared wealth, which turned out to be true, but also an openness in China's political system, which turned out not to be true. And of course, we also have had over the past 10 years in particular, growing kind of academic even discussion about the negative consequences of WTO, of the like China shock and entrance into the WTO on manufacturing jobs and middle income or lower middle income households in the U.S. Um, about 10 years ago, there was still a lot of enthusiasm for ways to engage in China. At that time, there was a lot of emphasis in the VC community that they were being told to go into China to
Venture capital.
Yes, venture capital, sorry. And they were told to go into China. We still believed that the more connections there were between our countries, our economies, the more we would become aligned, both economically and politically. And then something changed, or several things changed. And a lot of people would say that the inflection point was Trump, but I think that it came before that. I think actually 2012, so about a little bit over 10 years ago, is where we start to see some of these changes occur. Xi coming to power, the growth of Made in China 2025, increased concerns around corporate espionage, specifically around tech issues. There was a growing distrust. And in addition to that, the U.S. was finding that kind of relying on the tools of the liberal international order, in particular the WTO, wasn't working for the U.S. anymore because it was taking too long, right? And from the U.S.'s perspective, we had very specific examples of concerns around China coming in and creating overcapacity, heavily subsidizing industries, and then flooding U.S. markets and driving U.S. manufacturing out of business. The kind of example that's most widely used is the solar panel industry. So that was like, that's like kind of 10 years ago, we're starting to get this sort of changing view on whether the U.S.-China relationship is a good one, but that's still a concern that's largely around more kind of economic competition and a little bit less around national security issues. And then in the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's been an ever increasing concern about potential military concerns, not in a kind of direct war between the US and China, but certainly with respect to Taiwan, and certainly a lot of concerns that have also stemmed from specific examples of the ways in which China has been able to use its kind of economic weight to engage in coercive trade practices and so forth in order to further its own kind of foreign policy priorities globally. And so, people can also say, well, the U.S. does that as well, particularly with financial sanctions. But the U.S. is, from a U.S. perspective, they view China increasingly as using these tools in ways that are concerning for the U.S. And so there's been more and more interest in the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C., but also in the executive, to engage in a variety of policy entrepreneurship to try to find a way out of what is perceived to be, a 20-year kind of 20-year period in which the U.S. has lost a lot of ground to China.
Right. So and I will come back, I want to come to Congress here in a second, but I think it's useful that you point out that the intensification of relationship, of the tensions and the intensification of those tensions with China predated Donald Trump, because there's always that, at least my perspective being over in Europe, is that when Trump came to power, he blew up the international liberal order, and it's really different. And I've always had to say, well, actually, there's a lot of continuity in American foreign policy and American policy generally from one president to the other, or across from Republicans to Democrats. And there's actually quite a bit of consistency. And the narrative that you provide shows that actually a lot of this predates Trump and is now carrying on actually with Biden, right? So that leads in me to the question of what are how bipartisan is this issue around China? So I can see the kind of economic competition perspective now that's it's becoming a security issue around national security. How partisan is that, and where are the different forces, and how do they kind of meld together and shape the U.S. response?
Yeah, so national security, particularly as it relates to China, is quickly becoming like the new third rail of U.S. politics. I think also increasingly in Europe as well. And so there's incredible bipartisan support for policies that are perceived as being tough on China across a host of issues. A good example of this is that FIRMA, which is the Foreign Investment Review Modernization Act, or Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, excuse me, which passed in 2018, was one of the very few pieces of legislation that was not a tax cut that got through the Trump administration. And it did so with overwhelming bipartisan support, regardless of whether there had been a Republican or Democrat in the White House at that time. I am confident that we would have gotten an update to that was the legislative update to CFIUS, which is the U.S. Investment screening mechanism. So there's a lot of bipartisan support for policies that are perceived to be kind of clamping down on China. There's a view that China has taken advantage of the U.S. and that spans across the aisle. What is different is kind of slightly, there's some differences on tactics, which are kind of, very wonky, but at a broader level, there's a difference in terms of how these issues are sort of talked about and what sorts of interest groups are kind of brought into the equation. So a good example of this is when it comes to right now, the U.S. is going through a process of developing an outbound investment review or outbound investment regulation, actually. And so there's an executive order around that, but there's also a desire within Congress to pass legislation. And the two senators who are supporting this are John Cornyn, who's a Republican from Texas, and Bob Casey, who's a Democrat from Pennsylvania. And when you hear Cornyn talk about this issue, he's focused specifically on military technology and the military competition with China. And he's really hyper-focused on that because he's a security hawk, kind of a typical kind of Reaganite Republican. Casey is much more focused on trying to think about kind of yes, those national security issues, but if he had his druthers, there would be a whole additional kind of layer of outbound that would also be thinking about issues around unions and protecting union jobs and kind of critical infrastructure and critical supply chains, and much more kind of focused on reshoring, not just for kind of very narrow national security issues, but also for broader kind of U.S. competitiveness and ensuring that union jobs continue to be protected and grow in the U.S.
Right. So that's an interesting point. Then how, because again, taking the Chinese perspective, or looking at it from the perspective of China, they have become increasingly competitive. And you can say that partly that's, they've taken advantage of the openness of the world economy, of the US economy, of Europe. They've acquired a lot of technologies. But at the same time, their growth and their competitiveness is partly to do with the massive scale at which and speed at which Chinese companies and entrepreneurs are pushing forward, in the sense that, yes, they're dumping lots of cars, but actually is the overcapacity because of subsidies, or is the overcapacity because they've just simply the scale of it? And I guess the point being is that How do we separate out the legitimate China's just a booming economy, and so of course it's going to become more competitive, from the it's not fair that China is taking this technology? How are we able to pinpoint what is being stolen, if you like, and to put it in crude terms, what is being taken advantage of from the perspective of, well, China's just, it's embraced markets and entrepreneurship. And yes, obviously the state is actively involved. And yes, there are state-owned banks, and yes, there's subsidies. But you can say that about a lot of what's happened in the United States. And, we finance things, and, military spending is an industrial policy of the United States, right? So how is it, and this is what the Chinese will say, right? Is that, well, you accuse us of supporting this, but look at all the handouts you're giving to industries here, and it might not be at the federal level, but look what states are doing, or cities, right? So they're really, they're quick to put up the mirror. So then how is it, though, that we're able to separate out the legitimate concerns of, yes, they're taking from the China's just competitive on the count of it's become more competitive? How is that narrative, or how is that debated in the US?
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, not super well, because there's a lot of, there's not a lot of room for nuance, particularly, the flip side of, we're always talking about how isn't it, don't we want to have more bipartisanship? But one of the problems with bipartisanship is that, everyone wants to, no one wants to be painted as being pro-China in the US context now, right? So that makes it hard to have a nuanced policy debate about kind of how do we draw the line between what is inbounds for kind of intervention on national security grounds, and what is a little bit too much kind of about economic competitiveness, such that it should be scoped out, right? So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan loves to talk about how the US policy around China is really about a narrow yard and a high fence, right? So the idea is that we're going to try to find a narrow set of technologies that are very national security specific, and we're only going to carve out those for protection, but we're going to build a really, really high fence around that. The question is, who gets to decide how we're defining what is a small yard, and how are we deciding, how high that fence is going to be? And so I would say that the kind of immediate response from US policymakers would very likely be, well, it would be one thing if China really was a market economy, and if they had reciprocally opened up their economy to the US, but they haven't. And there are still a lot of barriers to the types of goods and services that the US is most competitive in getting into China. One of the things that the US had really tried for years to get the Chinese to do is to open up their financial market, which would have been very beneficial to US firms. But China's not going to do that, because this goes into actually my first book, but if you open up your financial market, you're taking away the ability of the party to really be able to use the financial system to direct credit to the areas of the economy that they most want to do. So that's not going to happen. So, the kind of in the first instance, US policymakers will say, well, China only wants to push their goods out to us. They don't want to open their economy to us as well. And and the basis of trade is reciprocity, and they're unwilling to give it to us. And then I think that there's another issue here that's about, issues around the large demographic challenges that China faces as its population ages, and it still has to find a way to employ lots and lots of people. And you're right that they are good at turning out a lot of goods that are increasingly kind of engaged in advanced technology, and they're going to find way that if they don't have domestic markets for that, they have to find markets elsewhere. And so these are really big tensions that don't have great answers to it. And this is really a political fight about who adjusts, which is a recurring theme in international relations and international political economy.
So in the U.S., though, I mean, Congress is bipartisan, it seems. What about the business community or the financial community? I mean, how are they reacting to U.S. policy, or how are they influencing it? Right, assuming that they are potentially influencing it, but it's not the case that Congress is captured by all business interests. How is that dynamic playing out?
Yeah, so this is actually the topic of a lot of my current work is around what I'm calling securitized political economy. And what is super interesting to me is how, among international political economy scholars, and I think among the general public, there's been this sense over the past 30 or 40 years that one of the big things that globalization did is it created a world in which big global firms kind of were politically ascendant and kind of got whatever they wanted, and it was very hard for political leaders to, particularly in democracies, to kind of pursue policies that these types of big major global firms didn't like. And what's really interesting is that the pace of investment screening mechanisms that have been put in place throughout the OECD, the pace at which in the US, in particular, export controls have proliferated, but also in other countries as well, the kind of rapid expansion of all of these kind of geoeconomic tools that impose costs on firms, both in terms of compliance, but also in terms of narrowing the availability of markets, has been breathtaking. And it has occurred, at least as I'm seeing it, largely in the absence of any kind of sustained and certainly very loud and public counter lobby. And I think that's because when economic issues are successfully turned into security issues, it becomes a lot harder for firms to lobby against them. And so we see ways in which, like for instance, when it came time to, or when the U.S. government or the U.S. Congress was debating that update to the CFIUS rules that I was telling you about before, there were some ways in very narrow kind of instances that businesses lobbied against particular provisions, but they largely seem to kind of drop out a lot of these conversations. They might go into kind of trying to provide feedback around the rulemaking process to try to kind of, in more narrow ways, kind of constrain the scope of how biting regulations are going to be. Right now, they seem to be confused and mostly want policy certainty and more focused on lobbying for industrial policy and other basically side payments. It's like, if you're going to regulate me in this way, then give me extra money on this side, and I won't, and then we'll call it even, right? And that, to me, seems to be the way that a lot of firms are dealing with this issue right now.
Right. So so I guess the question though is, are they inviting the protectionism, or are they just figuring out, well, if I can't, if you're cutting off the Chinese market to me, you're just going to have to buy me off. Is that what's happening? Or
I
in a
think,
sense,
yeah. Yeah, I think mostly it's the latter rather than the former. When it comes to some of the kind of issues around kind of more recently with respect to like reshoring some supply chains,
mm-hmm.
there's perhaps a little bit more kind of, well, you need to protect me against Chinese overcapacity, but that's largely in the context of if you are going to demand that I reshore
Yeah.
as opposed to allowing me to site my production wherever I want to, then you need to provide some kind of side payment to make that possible. It certainly is the case with respect to the most recent round of Section 301 tariffs that a lot
Mm-hmm.
of that is about trying to kind of prevent a world in which all of U.S. Investments industrial in industrial policies will kind of wither away as China's overcapacity kind of puts new U.S. companies out of business. And so, from that perspective, it's about reassuring companies that are thinking about investing in U.S. Productive capacities that they will be that will be a viable long-term kind of bet. But for the most part, these are not the first best strategies of firms. What they want mostly is openness. And
Mm-hmm.
in the absence of openness, then they need to have different reassurances in order to do the sorts of things that the US government is wanting them to do.
So you mentioned restrictions in OECD countries in Europe. I'm curious, where does Europe or the European Union, and for that matter, no longer a member, but the United Kingdom, where I am
Mm-hmm.
right now, where does Europe fit in all this kind of because again the hawkishness vis-a-vis China, it's I mean I guess partly because Americans are more open and vocal, whereas the debate in Europe is much more you know calm. It's not calm, but it's more reserved, it's more
Mm-hmm.
ambiguous. It's I mean obviously it's dependent on which country you're in, but there's that sense of who's pulling the strings, right? Is it German industry or is it the French? I mean, the UK has a election right now, so we don't know. But where does
Mm-hmm.
Europe fit in generally?
Yeah, so I'd say kind of two things about this. So the first is that just as I talked about how, at the top, how there are kind of two things happening in the US. One is around tech, and the other
Mm-hmm.
is around kind of this kind of energy transition and
Mm-hmm.
kind of what's the economy going to look like after that. I think in the US at least, kind of the conversation started with the tech and has kind of added on the kind of the energy transition component.
Mm-hmm.
I think the energy transition component is a bigger issue perhaps in Europe because we can see, for example, that Chinese EV penetration into the European market has just really gone gangbusters, to use a
Mm-hmm.
very American term,
Yeah.
right? So in 2019, I think that the share of Chinese EVs in the European market was like a 0.5%.
Mm-hmm.
And last year it was almost 10%. So that's a huge, huge increase in a very short period of
Mm-hmm.
time. So I think that within European capitals, as well as in the Commission, there are concerns specifically around how does Europe in particular respond in the context of being a collection of small open economies, in the context of having a harder time engaging in industrial policy than the US because of the particularities of concerns around things like state aid and
Mm-hmm.
issue. In the US, we don't have the same distributional concerns about subsidies going to Alabama versus Michigan
Mm-hmm.
as the EU has between subsidies going to Germany versus to the Netherlands, right? So,
Right.
so these are things in which the EU has the EU and Europe as a whole has a harder time dealing with than perhaps the US. So I think that kind of that's why a lot of the conversation in Europe has kind of coalesced around the idea of economic security, whereas in the US we hear economic security, but the government doesn't that's not their go-to in terms of how they talk about US-China competition or the different types of policies that they've been rolling out around these kind of geoeconomic frames. So that's the first part. And then the second part is that I think that Europe also is not just like the US is responding to China, but Europe is responding to China and to the US. Right? And so one of the other issues here that I didn't mention when you were asking about the differences among parties, like you're absolutely right that there's a lot of continuity between administrations when it comes to foreign policy and China policy. But one area in which I think there are really important differences is specifically around how the U.S. kind of thinks about and prioritizes its allies and partners. And a lot of the European kind of responses to, or kind of the development of investment screening and anti-coercion instrument and all these other kind of things that the European Union and others in Europe have been developing over time, that a lot of that is also born out of concern that the U.S. might not be a reliable partner forever, and certainly wouldn't be a reliable partner in the context of a second Trump administration. And so Europe is having to really navigate kind of, if we think that China is a major kind of concern, maybe a little bit from a security perspective, but definitely from an economic competitiveness perspective. And the U.S. has kind of aided in the kind of I don't want to say destruction of, maybe that's a little bit too hard of a word, but maybe the neutering of the WTO and other kind of institutions that have helped to help the European economies thrive. Then how do they manage these challenges from both sides? And that's the European dilemma, and that's a dilemma that the U.S. has not had to really think through as much.
Right. No, but what is though? I mean, Europe is now remilitarizing, to put it in one way, because of the invasion in Ukraine, and Germany is committing hundreds of millions of euros now to its defense sector, or to defense spending. Will that not change the dynamic in the sense that, yes, the United States might not be a reliable partner, though personally I actually don't think that's the case. I think America will be a reliable partner, partly because the United States is still a liberal democracy, and there aren't that many liberal democracies in the world. And Europe, I think, historically has always been very close and tied to the United States. And I would assume then that, the United States will always be there. They might not foot the bill and, I think, demand more of Europe. But I guess so, to put this into a question, though, with Europe now focusing more on its defense, partly because the Americans have pushed them to, but also partly because of the reality of what's happening in Ukraine, and it's kind of a wake-up call, at least there's a concern. How does that then shape the relationship with China, or at least the relationship with investment regulations and economic competition? Because again, if the narrative in the US, which legitimizes this, is, it's about military security, and it's also economic competition, whereas in Europe, it's about economic competition, but when is it going to become military competition as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the kind of, I guess, first instance in which that will occur or is occurring is specifically around investment screening, because and European countries have have rapidly built out their investment screening capabilities. If we think about kind of the history of investment screening for national security purposes, most countries, at least at first, really focused their attention, like the whole point of investment screening was specifically to protect the defense industrial base. And the idea was that we weren't going to put equity restrictions on any specific industry, but we were going to make sure that, especially if a domestic business was possibly going to be acquired by a foreign entity, and that domestic business was integrated into the domestic defense industrial base, that there would be a mechanism through which the government could review that transaction, could prohibit it if it found that it was, too much of a risk, or put a bunch of restrictions around that transaction to mitigate the potential national security risks. And so, as there are more more companies that are integrated into a defense industrial base, there will be more potential targets of a cross-border merger and acquisition that would need to be reviewed. So that's one way in which you'll just see kind of almost kind of automatically an increase in concerns. But then, this has also a lot to do with how innovation is financed, and the relationship between the military and the financing of innovation. In the U.S., the military and the government as a whole has had a important but oftentimes overlooked kind of presence in kind of rolling forward new innovation through a variety of major kind of ways in which basic and applied research is funded. Big programs like the NSF and the NIH. My understanding, although I'm not a Europe expert, is that a lot of kind of the typical kind of analogs in especially the EU system is at the EU level. So like EU level investments in basic and applied research. So two things on that, right? One is so long as the EU is not the one that is developing out the military, right, then there's like a little bit longer of an arm between the military and the innovation economy. But then the second is we do see that with the recent package around economic security measures that the Commission released, that issues around research integrity was one of the kind of 5 areas of concern. And so that is an indication that at least at the EU level, this is being considered, as an important issue to be discussed. In the UK case, that's going to happen differently. And I'd love to hear what you think is going on there as the UK resident, and therefore has much more kind of understanding of what's happening behind the scenes than I do.
I think the UK case is, as I understand, it's fairly similar to the European case, right? In the sense that they want to be open for business with and from China, partly because they see the Chinese market as so huge and so significant that they're very careful about constraining China. And I also think it's partly to do with perhaps it's a kind of underlying liberalism. At least the idea of Europe was about this kind of, it's founded on liberal principles of openness and open trade, and obviously here in the UK, that openness to trade and liberalism is also quite important, which I guess leads me though then to a follow-up question that I have for you about this general increase in investment and screening and other forms of regulations that constrain Chinese uh, direct investment and equity investment as well into Europe. What's is there overreach? In the sense, I have a picture of Adam Smith behind me, right? So
Mhm.
let's kind of think about free trade and openness. Is there not a sense of overreach, right? So, I mean, what you've said already about American companies saying, okay, well, sure, but then you're going to have to pay for it. I mean, a classical liberal, I think, is thinking, like, oh my gosh, this is more statism, there's more direction of the economy,
Mhm.
and to put some flesh on this question, thinking about the recent EV or electric vehicle tariffs against China, you mentioned the energy transition. Say what you will, we share the planet with China, and China is a
Mhm.
leader in green technologies. And so, if we're going to kind of scale and diffuse green technologies to as many people and consumers, not simply in the rich world but around the world, I mean, we kind of need that openness, right? So, how do we know if who's going to stop the overreach, and is there overreach?
Yeah, that's an incredibly important question.
You don't have to give
Um,
an opinion.
yeah, I'm gonna be a little bit cagey on how I would answer that. That's a question for over a pint at a pub as opposed
Yes.
to over
What does
a
Sarah really think, right?
um, but I think that there's definitely a danger there. I would say that so a few things. So one is um, the answer to that question is probably a little bit hard to decide upon right now
Mm-hmm.
because it's going to depend on whether this is a moment in time in which the global economy is reorganizing and countries are kind of trying to kind of um, interject for like a little bit for a brief period of time because they know that this is super consequential, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to ensure that they are going to be able to be a part of the EV supply chain of the future. Given that we know that kind of the traditional automobile industry has been an important part of most industrial countries' pathway towards industrialization.
Mm-hmm.
So, you probably don't want to be in a situation in which you like kind of completely give away your domestic capacity around that kind of industry because it's such a key industry that's bringing
Mm-hmm.
in and supporting so many different component industries that go into that final productive piece. So, if this is a transitory period, then perhaps it's not as kind of much of a challenge to kind of the future of the global economy as it would be if we end up in a situation in which there are competing blocks and countries are and polities have sort of um, moved inward and they're really trying to kind of reduce um, their reliance on imports. Another thing that I think is kind of both a kind of failure of perhaps the US government to fully think through some of the implications of some of their tariff policies, but also a potential like way in which the kind of concerns over how these EV tariffs might delay energy transitions in other parts of the world, like might be a little bit of a kind of um, overly gloomy forecast is that China is still going to produce these vehicles, right? So if they're not
Mm-hmm.
going to the US market, and if they
Yeah.
don't go as frequently to the European market, if the Europeans move forward with substantial tariffs after this anti subsidy investigation as well, then they're going to probably go to other parts of the developing world, and these are
Mm-hmm.
going to be cheap cars that these other parts of the world could more afford. I say that that's a little bit of kind of that the U.S. needs a strategy around this, because if the U.S. really is worried about some of the national security implications of EVs for things like how connected they are and kind of all of the data that they're producing, then having all of these cars everywhere, excepting the US and maybe a little bit the EU, like I'm not sure how, if that is the real issue. It seems like it would be issue in these places as well. But from a kind of climate, an issue of climate, these countries having more access to cheaper EVs is a good thing. So that's one example, but I think that kind of the more general point is that we do have to be careful. I think that when we talk about issues of economic security and frame kind of issues in that context, what we're really doing is we're trying to say, hey, you know what? When we're just focused on market transactions, we are forgetting that there are negative security externalities to some of those market transactions, and we need to have some way of dealing with those market failures. And market failures happen in lots of different areas. So there's no reason why we shouldn't kind of step in during a market failure. But we also have to be honest about what is a market failure and what isn't a market failure. When we talk instead about these issues in terms of concepts like weaponized interdependence, that gets us into a frame of thinking that interdependence is bad. And I think that we want to be really reticent to adopt that way of thinking, because sure, there's vulnerabilities that come from openness, but there are lots of vulnerabilities that come from closure, right? I like to talk about, I don't know how useful this analogy is to a European audience, but Texas is kind of famous for the fact that its energy grid is not connected to the rest of the US. And they're very proud of this, like about how they're autonomous. And I guess if they, want to cede from the union, it will make it easier for them, I guess, right?
Except when it freezes.
Exactly. And then they need interdependence. They need interconnectivity, because then then they could get energy from other states, but they have foreclosed that as an opportunity because they have tried so hard to stay independent. And so I think that it's understandable that people are going to focus on vulnerabilities that come from connection. But I think that there needs to be a lot more people out there in public spaces making it very clear that there are also a lot of vulnerabilities that come from being closed off from others. And that is the thing that I think that we're missing the most in the conversation these days.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think just to play on that Texas analogy, just so listeners know, it was a couple of years ago, there was a major freeze in Texas, and the grid basically shut down, and it was fairly catastrophic, I think, for the state. But yeah, it put into relief how it's great, that you have this, you're not connected to the U.S. energy grid, but had they been connected to the U.S. energy grid, they would have been able to take power from different parts of the country, and it would have been perfectly fine. And actually now, going back to, the other part, which is interesting with Texas in relation to the energy transition, everybody thinks about oil, but Texas is one of the biggest producers of renewable energy in the United States right now. So it's actually in their interest to be connected to the rest of the U.S. energy grid so that they can sell that power, just like their oil pipelines and gas pipelines are shipped elsewhere in the United States. Now, if their electricity grid is connected, then they can sell that. So it kind of plays on that analogy. And I think if you think about, the energy transition, at least in the relationship with China, is that we share the planet with China, whether we like it or not. And so we want to be able to have that openness and that back and forth so that, we benefit from the connections rather than the closing us off. And I guess there's the other, economic and I think national security issue is that how do you prevent this from becoming a tit for tat and escalating to the point where you're creating the opportunities for the nationalists in the Chinese Communist Party to mobilize in a way that leads to an invasion of Taiwan, for example, because they can say, look at the West, it's not, look at, they're cutting us off. And China has lots of domestic economic issues around, and there's still an overaccumulation crisis. There's demographic issues. And if the Chinese Communist Party wants to maintain its rule, how does it do that if it's not growing? How does it do that if it's not able to trade? How does it do if it's become more of a pariah in the international system, or at least there's kind of tensions? Then they can mobilize by kind of appealing to some national myth. And who's the victim of that? Oh, it's Taiwan, and Taiwan has the technologies that we need. So it's like, how do you prevent that? Which then, I guess, how would you say then that we need to kind of lower the temperature while also still being very clear about these are the red lines and with China, and how do we actually prevent the espionage, prevent the kind of tech transfer that is unfair, or prevent the dumping of that destroys kind of capacity at home? How do we lower that while then also getting China to? Where's China in this? How do we get China on board?
Yeah. So I'm not a China expert, and especially not on their domestic politics. So anything that I provide here comes with the humility of someone who doesn't really know exactly what she's talking about when it comes to what's going to play well domestically in China. But I will say a couple of things. So one is, again, going back to this idea of if we want to think about economic security as being around addressing market failures that come from negative security externalities of market transactions, then that's fine. Like, I think that it's certainly not the case that there are none of those negative externalities.
Can you just, I think for listeners to understand, what do you mean by like negative security externalities, right? So it's a big term. So, I want to make sure that people know what you mean.
Okay. Yeah. So that means like when market actors, right, are making decisions, when they're making choices about how they're going to organize their production networks, and it's all based off of their kind of the profits that are internal to the firm, right? Then they could make choices that really push a lot of that activity into China in a way that creates a challenge for the US, because perhaps that means, for instance, that China ends up being the place where 70% of all critical mineral critical minerals are refined, right? And perhaps we don't want China to have 70% of that, because they have a track record of sometimes when they get into a diplomatic spat with another country, let's say Japan, preventing Japan for a while from having access to those critical minerals. And we don't want to be in a position where we're going to be denied access because we have a disagreement diplomatically, right? So that's a clear example of market actors that are making choices based off of market fundamentals that are not pricing in the security concerns related to having so much of production concentrated in one country, right? And so the idea there is that then that would indicate that there might be a real good reason why you would want the government to come in and do something to help not move all production out of China, but to have some more flexibility or resilience in your supply chain, so that you're not so dependent on one country, right? So it's fine to act in those ways, but you have to be honest about kind of what is the actual market failure and what isn't, and so if you're going to say that there are certain technologies that are just too important and too critical, have too many national security implications to kind of have this interchange with China, then you need to keep that list pretty small, right? So again, going back to this idea of a small yard and a high fence, people in the US government say that all the time because there's something that seems quite wise about that approach, but only if you're actually, honest about keeping that yard very small, right?
Right.
So that's one thing. And then the other thing is finding opportunities to increase kind of trust over time, to reduce this kind of negative spiral. And I think that comes through things like, I'm a big, we're both in higher ed. So I imagine that you would agree that one of the best forces for good are a bunch of people from a bunch of different countries coming together at university and learning from each other. And so I think
Absolutely.
cultural and educational exchanges are really important for being able to create person-to-person connections
Yes.
that help to develop trust over time among people and countries. And so I think taking away a lot of those barriers that have been erected over the last 8 years or so is really important. And I do think that, that you're right, that the more that we interact on a kind of as even of a playing field as possible between the US and China, the more we can have a more positive interaction. But that also includes China kind of reciprocating some openness. And I think that the fact that the US had been so open to trade and China was so reticent to kind of pull back on state control of its own economy and that it wouldn't really allow opening in areas of the economy that would have really benefited the U.S. kind of helped to create a narrative in which this was an unequal relationship that was, not benefiting the U.S. as much as it should. Now, it certainly benefited the U.S. in terms of access to cheaper goods,
Right.
but in an era in which people are increasingly concerned about kind of what are the jobs that people are going to have in the U.S. that really matters. So I think it's important to not kind of dismiss that. It's very easy for economists to dismiss that. Especially it was easy 10 years ago for economists to dismiss that because we all know that trade is welfare improving in the aggregate, but we really do need to think more on and also more at the short term about what this does, what these sorts of disruptions do to communities and to families and to individuals, and find ways to ensure that we can have positive exchange that doesn't seem to create so much kind of economic despair.
Right. So no, and I agree with you. And I think that's all very. I think it's important with regard to China is we have to disaggregate the Chinese people from the Chinese Communist Party and from Xi Jinping. I mean, we have to assume. I mean, this is a huge population, and we should be having exchanges. The globe. With them, and not assume that everyone, just because of their nationality or ethnicity is, tied to a particular political force, as it were. I mean, it's important that we have that exchange, and that's, I think, a very important fundamental liberal principle in the classical sense. And I'm thinking of Adam Smith here. I mean, the great thing about the Scottish Enlightenment was the bringing of ideas together. I mean, he wrote a lot about China. I mean, there was not a lot of interaction. There was interaction globally, but the sense of thinking about other people in other places and coming together, and we should be doing more of that. So one final question before I let you go is, and I have it written down here, is what will happen under the Trump presidency? I'm not saying that Trump is going to win. If the election was happen today, I think it's still early days. But in any case, going back to what we discussed earlier, is that there's continuity in American administrations, but the flavor can change and the intensity can change. I'm just curious, if there is a Trump 2, what would that mean for this? Would it be, you would assume it'd be more bombastic, I think, for that matter, but would it change the fundamental policy? And then to be fair, what would happen under Biden too? What would be the difference there? Leave listeners with that.
Yeah. So I think kind of the two things that I would be looking out for, because I would imagine that there could be differences between a Trump administration and a Biden administration, is first, I already mentioned this before, but kind of how much interest is there in multilateral coalitions.
Right.
So I'm going to put aside Ukraine, because I think that is a whole, Ukraine also is very clearly a military issue. And I'm talking specifically about economic security issues. So I'm gonna just punt on that, because that's a whole nother conversation. So one is multilateralism around, how much is there going to be an interest in working with the European community, like both in terms of the EU and the UK, but also other important partners like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, India, on kind of presenting kind of a united economic front around certain issues. And so, this manifests today in terms of things like the TTC, which is the Transatlantic Trade, or the Technology and Trade Council, between the US and the EU, but there are other initiatives as well that include others, including the UK and Japan and so forth. But there's also kind of an interest in doing some coalition building around how to protect each other in the case of trade wars, such that if China tries to engage in kind of economic coercion against one member of that kind of community, will everyone kind of find ways to rush to their defense? I would imagine that those would be the types of initiatives that that a second Trump administration would be kind of less interested in kind of continuing. So that would be a place that I would watch, is specifically around what does multilateralism look like, and how important is it to U.S. foreign policy in these areas. And then the second is actually one that might seem very technical, but I think is important, which is how willing is the U.S. To use very kind of unilateral financial sanctions, and also certain types of export controls that really rest heavily on what's called the foreign direct product rule, which is like another very extraterritorial way of engaging in regulating these kinds of economic activities. And we see this right now even in Congress, because there are some in Congress that want to address issues of outbound investment through just financially sanctioning any Chinese company that they deem to be too connected to the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA. And so that is a very aggressive way of using U.S. dollar dominance and
particularly because the Chinese Communist Party has connections with pretty much all firms. I mean, I don't know about the People's Liberation Army, but the embeddedness of the Chinese state and Chinese firms, public and private, or state-owned and private, is there's, if you have a private company, but then it has a CCP kind of party board, I think they have these things in, then that basically means all of China. And then that becomes arbitrary, right? Where someone, some senator says, oh, we're going to go after this company. And that's really dangerous.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that approach for a lot of different reasons. But that is something that I would worry about coming from a Trump administration. Okay. And so that's where I'll leave it.
Okay. Well, on that note, for coming on and for giving us your perspective on U.S.-China and European relations related to investment screening. You're doing great work, academic work, and as well as engaging in the think tank community in Washington, D.C. through the Atlantic Council and previous work with the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'm sure we'll see much more of you in this space. You are one of our go-to people. Sarah, thank you so much, and hope to have you on again.
Thank you so much, Adam.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.